Well, let's start this off. So, thanks for coming, everyone. This is our first workshop for the parents of student athletes, and today we have Kacey to talk about goal setting, helping our kids with their goal setting practices. I need to learn this too. So, Janae, thanks for showing up. Maybe for some context, like I have a 16-year-old daughter, junior in high school and trying to figure stuff out on her own. How about yourself? I'd love to know like how best to help you if we knew like what you're
Sure.
looking for, and
Yeah.
are you a coach yourself or a parent?
Well, I'm both actually. So I'm a parent of a 17-year-old football player,
Okay.
and I'm actually from Canada, so he's hoping maybe he can transition into playing junior football next year, or eventually wants to maybe go on and see if he could get some kind of scholarship. So there's that. And then my job is actually that I work with youth athletes. And so I'm always curious, though I feel like I can learn from other professionals on. But it's always funny when you're the mom hat. My kid thinks I know nothing.
Yeah, we need proxies. I think that's
Yes.
we all need
He'll have to say,
proxies.
well, Graham, Casey says.
Right.
My
Right.
son doesn't listen to me either. He's only 6, but I
Yeah.
think we're gonna have a battle there as well.
I laugh to my son. I say, other people's children really like to come in and talk to me about their athletics. So,
Exactly. That's funny.
The youth athletes that you work with, what are they? What sport are they playing in?
they
What
are,
ages?
I work with hockey. Well, I did work with a football player, wrestler, mainly hockey and baseball right now.
Okay.
Awesome. And are you a coach, or what is your role with them?
My role is mental performance coach.
Oh, okay.
So I'm
Okay.
working towards my CMPC.
That's awesome. Very neat. Well, you'll probably, a lot of this will probably be incredibly familiar to you then.
Okay. Well, that'll be reinforcing then, Casey. I will appreciate that.
Right.
All right, Casey, you wanna drive? You can take it away now.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so I am going to share some slides at the beginning, more so just to kind of go through an intro to why this is important and how we can talk to our athletes about why it's important, whether it's your kiddo, whether it's somebody you're coaching or working with in whatever capacity. So let me get those pulled up real quick. All right. Mm, All right. So I think the biggest thing for me, especially working with youth athletes, is kind of figuring out how do we empower them, because I think we can teach them skills, we can tell them skills, but if they're not bought in, then they're not going to use them, and then certainly they're not going to be effective, right? So I think the biggest thing is not only the skills themselves, but figuring out a way to connect with the athlete on them. So one common question I start with when I'm working with athletes, and especially when I'm working with groups of athletes, is I'll put these questions up on the board and have them think about this from their own vantage point in their own sport. So I'll ask them to think about what percentage of their performance do they think is mental. 0 to 100%. I tell them there's no right or wrong answer, but I just want them to start throwing out some percentages. And usually for this one, athletes will throw out somewhere in like the 60 to 80 range, that there's a lot of mental aspects to their performance. I'll then ask them what percentage of mistakes they make are due to mental errors. And I'll say, okay, if you're completely prepared, if you've trained the way that you have wanted to and all your preparations there, and then you're in a pressure situation and mistakes occur, what percentage of those are mental mistakes? And most athletes in this instance will say even higher numbers, because if they've done all the preparation and they've put themselves in the best physical skill set possible, then usually they're making mistakes because they lost focus or they lost confidence, things along those lines. And then I'll pause and ask them how much time do they spend on a structured mental skills plan. And again, most of them say very little. And then I like to talk to them about the fact that it doesn't mean you have to spend the same percentage of time on a structured mental skills plan, but devoting some specific intentional time to mental tools, even if it's just 10 minutes a day, is going to make a big difference in reducing the number of mental mistakes that an athlete makes when they're performing. So kind of building off that concept of, if you want to gain an edge, if you're out there on the field or the court and all of the other athletes have similar training, similar backgrounds, they've all invested in the skills coaches as well. The thing that can give you an edge is if you've done the mental skills training, and that's going to give you that edge over your opponents. So I try to tie it into that because I know a lot of these youth athletes are investing a lot in time spent training, doing stuff with skills coaches, putting in the extra work, the conditioning, and yet this piece is missing, and they're wondering why all that stuff's not paying off. So sometimes we'll get buy-in if we show that the extra little bit of this can give them an edge and maximize all that other time they're spending working on physical skill sets and training. I'll then talk a little bit about what are some of the personal characteristics of elite athletes. This is of course nowhere near an exhaustive list, but I put these ones up because I think they tie into some of the goal setting pieces that I'll get into. But one of the things I want to work with athletes on isn't just being confident, but being consistently confident. Not only just a blanket motivation, but being intrinsically driven. So how do I motivate myself and not just based off external reward or reinforcement or results? Having that competitiveness that's very process driven. So we're going to be looking at process goals as opposed to just results and outcomes. Really embracing that growth mindset of evaluating goals and then reframing them or revisiting them is all part of growth. And so if I'm using it in that way, right, then there's never actually failure that occurs because that is still leading to continuous growth in my mindset and my performance. And then we do really find that like high level athletes use mental skills training and they use some forms of mental skills. And so allowing athletes and youth athletes especially to know, allowing them to know that our pro level athletes use these tools, our college level athletes use these tools, and just reminding them that this isn't just something that you use if something's going wrong, but these are the proactive tools that the highest, most elite athletes utilize, and maybe being able to capitalize on that to get them some buy-in to use these skill sets. So there's obviously a lot of different mental tools we can use today. Our focus is on goal setting, but the biggest thing again is figuring out how do we empower our athletes instead of them feeling like it's either forced upon them or something that we're just saying you need to do this. And so a few of the ways that I think we can help in allowing them to feel some element of control and feel like they're engaged in an active role is participate in goal setting with them early on in order to help teach them how to do it, but then not just setting the goals or telling them the goals. And I think this especially goes for coaches, right? Sometimes we tell our athletes, do this, but we don't necessarily engage them in the goal setting, and then they're not going to be as bought in. But I think the more we can get them to participate and take some ownership over setting goals, the more engaged they're going to be in that. And again, that's both for short-term goals and long-term goals, and teaching them that both are really important in their performance. I also think helping them develop their own beliefs and values about their sport so that they can tap into and understand their own why and have their own personal reason for like, why is this important to me? Why am I doing this sport? And that can vary greatly, and that's okay. And I think having it personalized to each individual is huge. And that's when we run up against adversity or struggles, helping remind our athletes to tap into their why is hugely important, because then they have something to go back to that's going to kind of push them to keep setting goals, even when they face some adversity or maybe when they're fatigued or things along those lines. And then another one I think that helps empower our athletes is being open in our communication with them about decisions. So not just dictating to them that, hey, we decided this, you need to do it. Or me and your coach decided this is a good game plan or this is a good competition for you to enter, but communicating the why behind it. Because again, I think I get a lot of youth athletes who are just told what to do, but they don't really understand why. And then they're less inclined to be committed to that. So I think the more we can be open in our communications, the more they feel they've got an active role, they can ask questions, and they can really understand the intent and the purpose behind some of the things that are being asked of them. Okay, to launch into goal setting, I'm just going to go through a few of these, and then really we design this to want to be more interactive and dialogue based. So I'm going to introduce a few of these concepts around goal setting, but then I want to go through some of the questions that people have sent in. And Janae, if you have any questions, make sure that we can address those and just kind of have a discussion about them. So one thing I like to remind our athletes is it is really easy to focus on results. It's really common for us to hear goals around results. I think that's how our system is designed in a lot of ways. But if we're only focused on results, we're not going to change. A lot of times I'll talk to my athletes about the fact that if we focus on your process goals, the results will follow. So we don't need to be overly focused just on the outcomes and results. The process goals are designed to help set us up to achieve outcomes and results that we would be happy with and proud of. But that's obviously the first bullet point I have there. I think process goals and teaching youth athletes how to engage in process goals is incredibly important. Those are obviously goals that they have more control over. Those are goals that keep them more present focused. Those can be more short-term goals. And again, I have a lot of pro athletes who are never going to deny that the results and the outcome are important to them. And so I validate that, but I say, but if that's what you're focused on, you're not going to be present and in the moment to be able to achieve that. So we're just kind of acknowledging and validating the outcome and the results goals while shifting back to keeping the focus on the process and the controllables. Another piece that I tap into to drive goal setting is how much it can impact motivation, right? So if we're going into a practice every day with I'm just going to get through practice and check the box, that's not very motivating. It's easy to fall into just kind of going through the motions or being content, as opposed to I'm going to identify each day when I go in what my goal is. How am I going to define success in this practice today? And that can be based off of how hard I work. That can be based off of certain technical goals I've developed for myself, certain number of repetitions. The more specific an athlete can be, if we think of SMART goals, if they're specific and measurable, all of those things, then at the end, they're able to then evaluate and go, how did I do achieving those goals today? And then how do I take that and use that to apply for goals tomorrow for the next day? Again, like I said, it's really easy to lose motivation when we're not tapping into having specific goals for ourselves day in and day out. And we can just kind of fall into that rut of just going through the motions. So I try to teach athletes that really early. It also keeps them feeling, again, empowered, engaged, like they have some element of control. And I'll tell them, yeah, you can't control the practice and what your coach is setting up. But once you know what the framework for the practice is, then you can apply some specific goals for yourself of what you want to achieve in that practice. Obviously, I think they work to provide positive reinforcement and strengthen confidence as well. So athletes who struggle with being overly self-critical and who are struggling with confidence, I really highlight the fact that if you're setting goals, then you can end a practice or a game or whatever it is and reflect on those and be able to highlight some things that you did well and be able to use any things that didn't go well more constructively. So then you're not just sitting there criticizing yourself for like, hey, I didn't do this, this, or this right. You're going, okay, I'm going to acknowledge these as growth areas and use it to set a goal for tomorrow. So it minimizes getting stuck in self-criticism, but it also balances out providing more positive reinforcement. Even if the results didn't line up, there are still things I can acknowledge based off the process that I did well. That's going to help positively reinforce my confidence and keep that growing over time. I also think for athletes who struggle with that confidence piece, especially if they're journaling about it, they can then look back and go, wow, look at all these things I've done well day in and day out of practice. And even though today I'm feeling kind of crummy about how I did, I can look back and not lose my confidence because I can see all these positive things that I've done over the last few weeks, months, whatever. So I think the way we apply our goal setting and the lens we use can vary depending on the athlete, but these are some of kind of the big points that I encourage and some of the benefits of doing it with our athletes and doing it on a consistent basis. And I think if they can buy into that and then they can feel empowered to take ownership over their goals, that just helps with the engagement in the long term. Okay, so I want to pause there because I know I ran through a bit of stuff, but this is kind of the point where I'd rather engage in a little bit more of discussion and dialogue about it and open it up to some questions about the goal setting and the purpose and application of that. Janae, I do know that there were some people who submitted questions, but since you're on here, I'd like to ask you first before we go through any of those, if you had any questions, thoughts, reactions.
I think a lot of those, they make sense, and I appreciate that when they can focus on the process goal, it separates them, I think, from that big outcome result that they're seeking. I think that would be really helpful. So yeah, that would be my only, I echo, I understand those. So I'm curious what other people's questions might be.
Yeah, absolutely. Robert, do you want to pull up some of the questions that you had people send in? And you're on mute.
I'm trying to figure out how to turn my camera back on.
I can see you.
Oh, you can.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So my question came from Johan. He's in South Africa, so he couldn't join us at this hour, but he was saying, he asked, how can we motivate and convince young athletes that it's not just about winning or setting outcome goals? I mean, and if athletes want to reach their full potential, is there space for them to develop an identity outside their sport as well? Or should their main focus be on being the best in their sport, like Tiger Woods? So
Yeah, so while it's fresh in my mind, I'll address that second part of the question first. First and foremost, I think a lot of that's individualized. I do advocate for balance. I think balance is incredibly important. And I think without it, sometimes people get overconsumed by identity with their sport, by pressure, things along those lines. I think everyone can vary, though, in their capacity to what that looks like and how much balance they need. But yes, I think being able to be really intense in your sport and be focused and locked in is easier to do when you can also step outside of that, give yourself a mental break, have some balance, have other pieces of your identity that you really value so that you're not overly adding just pressure on one element of your life. I'd just say what that balance looks like is going to differ athlete by athlete. As far as the first part of the question, I think it was how do we teach them not to just be results driven? I mean, I think that does start with no worries. Thank you for joining. We appreciate it.
thanks, Jen.
I do think that starts with the messaging we hear from people around us, right? So as a parent, I think you can help teach your athlete early on that it's not all about results and really praise some of the process things that you see and positively reinforce aspects of the process. I think a lot of it is teaching and educating. I also think just kind of highlighting how the process can benefit us. And again, I think there's going to be athletes where they're going to be reluctant to let go of the outcome. And those are the cases where I don't try to force and deny that the outcome is important, but I'll say, like, hey, even if there are outcomes that are important to you, focusing on that takes you away from the present, right? So, how the process can help you achieve those is by being present, being locked in, focusing on what you can control. So, trying to tap in with each athlete to how there's a gain depending on where their mental framework lies around that.
Kacey, I have a follow-up on that. Like, can you give some examples of process? Like what could, so we, like for myself, and just better understand. I it sounds obvious, but I'm just wondering if there's some examples you could give.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, to me, those process goals can vary, right? Like some process goals can be related to effort and okay, what am I putting in terms of effort? Some process goals can be related to implementation of mental skills. I also think sport by sport, process goals can be related to how do I like technically or tactically execute something versus it's not, I want to score this goal, but it's like, how do I want to execute, hitting my stick to the puck in this moment, right? So it might be more about like technical execution. It might be more about like speed. It might be more about power, things along those lines, as opposed to like, I want to score the basket or I want to make the goal. It's kind of the physiological, technical pieces that lead to that, as well as the effort pieces, the mindset pieces that you have control over.
Would you include habits in there too? Like going to sleep at the same time every night or something like that? Is that
Yeah, I think there certainly are behavioral goals that athletes can have that aren't even being when they're like on the court, on the ice, on their playing field. And
right?
so, yes, they can control that. I consistently have a good sleep routine and I fuel my body appropriately and I take care of myself. So, yeah, I think there are definitely habits, behaviors, routines outside of the immediate being in the immediate moment of the performance that can contribute to that as well.
Okay. Here, I have another question. This one's from Tyler. He says that his sixth grade son was an all-star little leaguer 2 years ago, but he hasn't had the same success since then. And this coming spring is his final little league season, and he has set a goal to become an all-star once again. And while his son cares about getting better, he doesn't necessarily self-start when it comes to practicing. What are some practical ways to help him take more initiative over the next 12 months while also not being a pushy parent? I think we all have
Yeah.
those struggles.
Right. Yes, finding that balance. I guess one thought that first popped into my mind is why is that goal important to him? And so I think and maybe he knows that, maybe he doesn't, but I think I would first and foremost want to understand why that goal is important because it goes back to that intrinsic motivation of what's the purpose behind it? Why do you want to strive for that? And again, I think that can help maybe with the self-starting piece if he's identified a why. So that would be one maybe discussion as a parent that I would have with him so that then I could help reinforce his why. I also would encourage him to develop other process goals throughout the season, day-to-day process goals, but also short-term goals so that he's not just focused on that one. Sometimes when we only have one goal and it's in the distance, in that moment it's hard to self-start because that feels so far off right then, right? So the more we've got those more immediate goals, it's a little bit easier to like self-start and want to push ourselves because then we can get a reinforcement earlier on as opposed to, well, I'm working really hard, but I'm not going to get reinforced until the end of the season, right? So I think encouraging and helping him understand why that would be important and why that would be helpful, especially if he does have a strong reason why, a strong why about it. And then it becomes him taking ownership of, okay, here's my why, here's my motivation, and here's how I'm going to set goals to keep myself accountable to that throughout the season and keep myself working hard.
So is that kind of, I guess, Casey, that's like working backwards, right? Like, what are the baby steps that I
Hmm.
need to take to get there? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So what are the things that I can do now that don't guarantee that outcome, but what are the things that I can do now that set myself up for the best chance of that outcome?
Right.
Hmm.
So this is I have the same question. How do you know, my daughter's so smart. She can tell when I'm like trying to guide her in a certain way, like, and I'm kind of going, how do I avoid that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a balance, right? I mean, I think as parents, you offer support and you can encourage things, but I think I mean, sometimes you might even ask your child, like, how can I best support you in achieving this goal? So if this goal is important to you, I want to help, but I also want to do so in a way that feels appropriate to you. So maybe we sit down together and let's brainstorm and decide, like, what are things that I can do? Because again, if they've brainstormed it with you and they've agreed that, like, hey, dad, checking in with me once a week to see where I'm at and if I'm being, intentional
Okay.
with my goals is helpful, then when you do it, it won't feel like you're just pushing that on the kiddo. It would feel like, hey, we decided on this together. I agreed to it, I'm more likely to receive it well. So I might just have that dialogue with the kiddo and kind of figure out what that is and decide on a plan so that both of you have agreed upon that.
And I want to go back to like something was one of your bullet points was like defining the why. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
wondering like what happens and how often do you see it when the player's why is different from the parent's why? Like, and like
Yeah.
how do you manage that from a coach's point of view? Like in like I don't know, it's hard for parents sometimes to
Yeah,
disassociate themselves.
and the parents' why can be different than the kiddos, and the parents' goals can be different than the kiddos, right?
Mhm.
And so I do think that's why it's important to help figure out what the kids' why is so that we're less inclined to be pushing somebody else's reason on them. Because again, if we're doing it for somebody else's reason, we're not going to probably stay as committed. We're not going to feel as much enjoyment. We're not going to hold ourselves as accountable, all of those things. And so the parents' why may be different, but if you also understand your kiddos' why, you can help remind them of that and kind of go, remember you're doing this for these reasons, right? This is why this is important to you, even if your why might be a little bit different.
Okay. And one last question was like you mentioned like when you're working with your kids, with your players, and you're talking to them about, setting goals and stuff. It occurred to me like there's this period of like how much time do you give them? Like you're like what's your expectation? Like, hey, I can tell them this 1 week, but how do you track their progress and how long do you think it you see them kind of like start to absorb like what you're coaching them about? Like,
And I think that can vary, right? But I think that's why it's important to like enter goal setting with the framework of them being adjustable because you might start out somewhere and go, okay, this is a good balance of realistic yet challenging. And then, you might check in with them in a week and realize we've got to adjust this goal a little bit. Maybe it wasn't challenging enough, or maybe it wasn't realistic. And so I think starting out, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but starting out the discussion about goal setting with kiddos of like, these are designed to be flexible and that sometimes they're going to need adjustment, but we're going to try to set these realistic, challenging goals. But it's okay if, like, in a week's time, we've got to make that adjustment. So I think teaching them that and then just being really in tune with each individual. And okay, we practice these goals for a week. How do we feel like how are we doing on these? Do we feel like they're challenging us? Do we feel like we're able to determine how to adjust them for the next day? Right. So I think it's just
okay,
active dialogue. And I don't think every athlete will respond the same in the same time period. So just being open to individualizing it.
okay, great. Those are all the questions. Like how Alan and Abigail, I don't know if you have anything you want to ask or have questions about.
Or add.
Yeah, no questions. It was amazing, Kacey, from the content, and Robert from your questions, but also I think like your moderating from kind of the point of view of a parent who this content is appropriate for. So like I think it was really good. I'm just now thinking about like how we marketed and fine tune it, but like the content was really good. And I think the questions both that you added to Robert and that we got from the community were great. I think we just need more of them. But yeah, like
Okay,
this was amazing.
well, thank you.
Yeah.
So, Abigail, we were Kacey and I said we were the guinea pigs. We went out first. So I hope there's something here you can take away for your session coming up.
Absolutely. And I think building on the sense of empowerment, especially as we talk about working with female athletes, this is a great starting point for us. And I think it's just going to continue to help us evolve in this space, which is great. So thanks, Kacey, for starting the conversation and Robert for hosting.
Thanks for joining, guys.
All
Yeah.
right, so thank you very much for everyone.
A great
All right.
start. Yeah, no, it's good. It's good.
Okay,
All
cool.
right. Thanks, everybody. All right,
Thanks,
bye.
Casey. Thanks,
All
everyone.
right. Thanks,
All right.
guys. Thanks, Robert. Bye.
Bye.